The candle has already been lit. It was lit before you arrived. It sits on the table near the hearth, a tallow candle, short and fat, made from the rendered fat of last autumn's sheep. It smells faintly of the animal it came from. Not unpleasantly, just honestly. Just the way everything in this room smells honest, of smoke and damp wool and whatever was in the pot earlier, something root vegetables, something with barley, the ghost of it still hanging in the warm air near the fire. The fire is the thing you notice first. It is low now, the evening fire banked carefully to last the night, but it breathes, it shifts and settles, and the sound of it, that particular crackle, that soft exhale of wood becoming ash, fills the room in the way that silence fills a room in a modern house, not absent, present, warm and present, warm. Outside it is dark in a way that most of us have never experienced. Completely dark, absolutely dark. The kind of dark that makes the firelight inside this cottage feel not just warm but necessary, like a held breath, like something sacred. You're in a peasant cottage in medieval England. The year is somewhere in the 14th century. The family who lives here has been awake since well before dawn. Come in, sit down near the fire. We have the whole evening. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The cottage, its rooms, its geography, its smell, the hearth as the centre of everything. Let me tell you what this room actually is. Not what you picture when you hear the word cottage, not the tidy, rose-covered, chimney-smoking version from a painting or a Christmas card. What I want to give you is the real thing. The actual dimensions, the actual smell, the way the light behaves, the way the floor feels underfoot. Because when you understand what this space actually was, you stop seeing it as a backdrop for something else, and start seeing it as a world, complete, sufficient, intensely, specifically alive. The typical English peasant cottage of the 14th century was a single room. One room. Not one room plus a sleeping loft. Not one room with a separate kitchen or a little outbuilding used for storage. One room, approximately 15 to 20 feet long and perhaps 12 to 15 feet wide. The floor was packed earth. Sometimes it had a thin layer of rushes laid over it, dried marsh grass gathered from riverbanks, spread across the floor to provide a small degree of insulation against the cold rising from the ground. Over time, those rushes would collect everything, dropped food, ash from the hearth, the dirt from boots, whatever the animals tracked in if animals shared the space, which in winter they often did. There is a word for this kind of floor, this accumulated layer of rushes and debris and daily life, and the word is not comfortable. The word is functional. This was a floor that worked. I want you to hold that for a moment. A floor that worked. In a world where almost every resource required significant labour to obtain, comfort was not the organising principle of a home. Survival was. Warmth was. Making it to spring with the family intact and the fire still lit was. Comfort was a byproduct when circumstances allowed it, not a baseline expectation. The hearth was in the centre of the room. This is the detail that stops people who are used to thinking about fireplaces, against a wall with a chimney, drawing smoke neatly up and away from the living space. In most English peasant cottages of this period, there was no chimney. The hearth was a low platform of stone or clay, positioned in the middle of the floor open on all sides. The smoke from the fire rose, or tried to rise, through a hole in the roof above it. A louvre, it was sometimes called. A small opening, often covered with a wooden flap that could be angled to help the smoke escape while keeping rain out. Sometimes this worked well, sometimes it did not. When the wind changed direction, the smoke had nowhere to go. It gathered in the upper half of the room, above head height, thicker on some evenings than others, and the family simply lived beneath it. The eyes adjusted, the lungs adjusted. This was Tuesday. I have read accounts by historians who have tried to reconstruct what the air quality inside these cottages would have been like, and the numbers are startling. During active fire use, the particulate levels in the air of a roofed, centrally hearted medieval cottage could reach concentrations that would today qualify as a health emergency by modern standards. By medieval standards, it was simply the smell of being alive and warm. Now here is the thing I keep returning to. The thing I find both strange and strangely moving when I sit with it long enough. The smoke was not considered a problem. It was considered a sign. A cottage with a good fire going, with smoke curling up through the roof hole into the evening sky. That was a cottage with a family inside it, fed and warm. The neighbours could see it. Passers-by could see it. In a world where cold and hunger were the real and constant threats, the smoke was a kind of signal. We are here, we are managing, we are alive. The hearth did not just produce heat, it organised the entire social geography of the room. Closest to the fire was warmest, obviously, and therefore most desirable. The elderly sat closest. Infants slept closest in whatever cradle or padded corner could be arranged near enough to catch the warmth, but not near enough to risk the sparks. The family's working life radiated outward from that central fire. Cooking happened at the fire, spinning and mending happened close enough to the fire to see by its light. The sleeping arrangements at night were arranged with the fire as the anchor. Everything moved in relation to the hearth. The walls of the cottage were typically wattle and daub, a frame of woven branches plastered over with a mixture of clay, straw and sometimes animal dung, then lime-washed or left plain. They were not insulating in any serious sense. They kept the wind out and the rain out most of the time, and in summer they breathed, and in winter they did not stop the cold so much as blunt its edge. The roof was thatched, straw or reeds, several layers deep, packed tightly and layered in a way that actually provided reasonable weather resistance when properly maintained. The thatch was also alive, in a manner of speaking. Insects lived in it. Small birds sometimes nested in the lower layers. The particular smell of old thatch after rain, that slightly damp, slightly fermented, deeply organic smell, was part of the sensory vocabulary of every person who lived beneath it. You did not notice it most of the time, the way you stopped noticing the smell of your own home, but when you came in from outside, especially from the cold and the clean air of an autumn evening, that smell hit you first. Smoke, thatch, tallow, cookpot residue, damp wool, and the particular animal warmth of human bodies having spent a long day in this space. That was home. That was what home smelled like. The furniture, such as it was minimal. A table, often rough-hewn planks, laid across trestles so they could be dismantled and moved. Stools or benches, chairs with backs, were a luxury that most peasant families did not possess, or had perhaps one of, reserved for the head of the household or a guest of some standing. A chest, almost certainly. The chest was important. It was storage for whatever cloth, documents, valuables, or seeds a family owned, and it was also sometimes a seat, sometimes a sleeping surface for a child or a servant. The chest was the one piece of furniture that almost every household across all economic levels of medieval England seemed to possess, because you needed somewhere to put the things that mattered. You needed to know where they were. On the walls, hooks, wooden pegs or iron hooks for hanging tools, garments, dried herbs, whatever needed to be off the floor and accessible. A medieval peasant's home had very little horizontal storage surface, and made up for it vertically, using walls and ceiling beams as the place where things lived. Bundles of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, chamomile, lavender if you could get it, hung from the rafters alongside strips of dried meat, if the autumn slaughter had been good, onions braided together by their stalks, dried mushrooms threaded on strings. The ceiling of a medieval cottage was not separate from the roof. It was the underside of the thatch. The crossed beams of the structure itself hung with the household's provisions. When you looked up in this room, you saw the architecture of the family's survival, the things they had gathered and preserved against the winter ahead. I find this genuinely beautiful, and I want to be honest about the fact that beauty is not a word people tend to use about peasant poverty. But there is something in that image, the dried herbs and the braided onions hanging from the rafters in the firelight, that I cannot look at without feeling something. A completeness, a sufficiency. Everything the family had was visible, everything they owned was known. The room contained their life, and their life was organised around keeping warm and fed, and the evidence of their preparations hung above their heads where everyone could see it. The cottage had, if it was reasonably established, one window. One, sometimes two, in a larger household or a slightly more prosperous one. The window was not glazed. Glass was expensive beyond ordinary imagining for most of the population, and so the window was a hole in the wall, covered in one of several ways depending on season and what was available. a wooden shutter, hinged to swing closed against rain or cold. A stretched and greased animal skin, called translucent but honestly rather dim, that let in a milky diffuse light when the weather permitted the shutter to be left open. A piece of linen cloth similarly greased. In the evenings, when the shutter was closed and the family was inside, the window was sealed. The room held its heat and its light and its smell. The outside was simply outside, weather and dark and the sounds of the village, which we will come to in a moment. Now let me tell you about the light. A tallow candle produces approximately 1 candle power of illumination. In modern terms, roughly the equivalent of a single watt of electric light. 1 watt. If you have ever been in a room lit by a single 40-watt bulb and felt it was a little dim, try to imagine dividing that by 40. 1 tallow candle in a medieval cottage did not fill the room with light. It made a small sphere of orange, wavering, intimate illumination around itself, and left everything beyond its radius in shadow. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, most commonly sheep or cattle. They smoked more than beeswax candles. They smelled more. They needed trimming. The wick needed to be pinched back or snipped as it burned, or it would gutter and smoke and waste itself. They were not cheap, and a family did not burn them carelessly. Rushlights were cheaper. A rushlight was exactly what it sounds like. A dried rush stem, stripped of its outer skin except for a single thin strip left on one side to hold it together, then soaked in rendered fat and dried. It was the medieval equivalent of a very economical candle. It produced a tiny guttering flame, burned for perhaps 20 minutes to half an hour, and could be made at home from materials that cost almost nothing if you lived near a marsh. Rush gathering was a summer task. Children and women collected armfuls of the long-stemmed rushes from riverbanks and marshy ground, then peeled them and dried them and soaked them, and the winter's worth of evening light was prepared through the work of a summer afternoon. The rushlight holder, a simple iron clamp mounted on a spike or a weighted base, designed to grip the rush at an angle so it would burn slowly, was one of the most common domestic objects in a medieval home. Here's the thing that I find difficult to fully comprehend from inside our own world of electric light, of switches and overhead panels and screens that produce their own illumination at any hour. In a medieval peasant household, evening light was a resource, a limited, rationed, carefully managed resource. You did not burn a candle to read by if you were not reading. You did not leave a rushlight burning in a room where no one was working. The fire gave enough light to sit by, to talk by, to do the most basic tasks. The candle or the rushlight was brought out when someone needed to see something clearly, to stitch fine work, to look at a document, to check on a sleeping child in the darker corner of the room. When the work was done, the light was extinguished. And then the darkness was complete. I want you to sit with that for just a moment. Not the dramatic darkness of a horror story, not the anxious dark of a power outage in a city where the streetlights still glow at the window and the neighbour's porch light spills in under the door. Real darkness. Absolute darkness. The kind that makes you aware of the shape of your own body because you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The only light was the hearth. That low banked fire, red and orange at its core, grey at its edges, breathing slowly, was the light source of the whole household for the entire night. It moved, it shifted, it threw shadows and pulled them back and threw them again. In that firelight, the braided onions and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters made shadows that moved on the thatch above. The family slept in the light of the fire. Together, all of them, in the same room, usually on raised pallets or straw mattresses or simple bedrolls arranged near the warmth, with whatever blankets or coverings the household owned pulled close. In colder nights, in the worst of January and February, the family slept together in the most literal sense of sharing body warmth as survival strategy. The children between the adults, the oldest and most vulnerable nearest the fire. The livestock, if there was any, might be brought inside in the coldest months. Chickens were routinely kept inside cottages. A pig or a goat might spend the winter in an end of the building divided from the family space by nothing more than a partial wall or a hurdle woven from branches. Their body heat was not a luxury. It was a material contribution to the temperature of the room. I once read a historian describe this sleeping arrangement. The whole family together, the animals nearby, the fire low and the darkness complete. as crowded, lacking privacy, insufficiently differentiated, and I understood what he meant in terms of modern categories. But I also thought, or it was warm, or it was how you knew everyone was alive, or it was the particular comfort of knowing that the sounds around you in the dark were familiar, were known, were the sounds of your own people breathing. There is a word in Welsh, hearth, that is often translated as homesickness or longing, but that does not quite map onto either of those English words. It carries something of longing for a place or a time or a feeling that may never have been precisely real, but that the heart recognises as home anyway. I do not know if the people sleeping in this cottage on a winter evening in the 14th century were happy. That word doesn't quite translate across that much time and difference. But I know they were together, and the fire was alive, and the darkness outside was held at bay by something small and warm and tended by human hands. And there is something in that, something in the image of it, that the heart, when it encounters it in the quiet before sleep, seems to recognise. When was the last time you sat in a room lit only by fire? If it has been a long time, or if you have never done it, I find myself wanting to suggest it to you, not as a historical experiment, but simply as an experience. Something quiets in a room lit only by fire. The edges of the world coming closer. The darkness beyond the firelight becomes a kind of permission to stop, to simply be in the circle of warmth, with no obligation to see further than the light reaches. The people in this cottage understood something about that. They did not choose it exactly, it was simply the world they were given. But inside the world they were given, they built something, a room, a warmth, a smell that meant home, and they tended it through the long evenings and the long winters with the specific care of people who knew that warmth was not guaranteed. Outside, the village is quiet now. The curfew bell has been silent for an hour. We will come back to that bell. But for now, stay here, near the fire, in this one room with its rushes on the floor and its onions hanging from the rafters, and its one tallow candle burning on the table. The family is settling. The children are almost asleep. It smells of smoke. It smells of thatch and tallow and the barley and roots residue of supper. It smells like being alive in the world 1400 years ago, on an ordinary evening in England. Someone woke before the others. There was always someone. In the peasant household of medieval England, this was not a role that needed to be assigned or negotiated or put on a schedule. It was understood, as deeply understood as the fact that the fire needed to be kept, as understood as the seasons and the work they demanded. Someone rose first. In most households of this period, that someone was the woman of the house, the wife, the mother, the daughter of the household in a home where age had overtaken the mother's capacity for it. She did not have an alarm, she did not need one. People who live without artificial light and who sleep in rhythm with the darkness develop a relationship with time that is almost entirely interior. The body learns it. The body knows, with a reliability that most of us have lost access to, the difference between the deepest hour of the night and the hour that comes just before the sky begins to change. She would have felt it before she heard it, before she saw it, a shift in the quality of the darkness, a change in something subtle and bodily, and then she was awake. The room was cold. Not uniformly cold. The hearth still held heat. Banked coals do not surrender their warmth all at once, and a well-managed fire, set right before sleep with the larger pieces of wood arranged to burn slowly through the night, could still be breathing faintly 8 hours later. The circle of warmth around the hearth was perhaps 3 or 4 feet across at this hour, and everything beyond it was the cold that had crept in through the thatch, through the gaps in the wattle and daub, through the chinks around the window shutter. She would have felt this the moment she left the warmth of the sleeping bodies. The floor under her feet, packed earth, a thin layer of rushes, was cold in a way that moved through the soles of the feet directly into the body. There was no gradual adjustment to it. It was simply cold, and then you were cold, and then you moved. She moved quickly, not frantically. This was not an emergency. It was simply Tuesday, simply the morning, simply the thing that happened every day and had to be done before anything else could happen. She crossed the room to the hearth, knelt, and leaned close to see what she had to work with. The coals were there. Almost always the coals were there if the fire had been properly banked. Orange at their centres, grey at their surfaces, still warm to a careful hand held close. The technique for rekindling them was not complicated, but it required knowledge, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands rather than the head, acquired through years of doing this exact thing, kneeling at this exact hearth, in this exact quality of pre-dawn cold. She gathered the coals together with a stick or the iron poker if the household had one. She blew on them, carefully, steadily, not too hard, because too hard scattered them and accomplished nothing. A long, slow, controlled breath directed at the orange centre of the nearest coal. Again, again, and then, the faintest brightening, a tiny thread of flame. She had it. Now the kindling. Dry straw, kept near the hearth for exactly this purpose. Dried grass, thin sticks, whatever would catch easily, and produce enough initial flame to catch the heavier wood. She fed it carefully, piece by piece, the way you feed anything fragile, with patience and attention, and the knowledge that rushing would undo what you had just accomplished. The fire grew. And as it grew, the room changed. The quality of the darkness changed first, before the warmth changed. Firelight is orange and moving, and when it begins to strengthen, it does not simply illuminate, it animates. The shadows on the wall began to shift. The bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters came back into visibility, swaying slightly in the warmth the fire was beginning to produce. The sleeping forms of the family, wrapped in whatever they had, children tucked close together, were visible now as shapes, as presences, breathing slowly, breathing. She could see them. There is something about this, about the act of being the first awake, the one who lit the fire and restored the warmth to the room before anyone else opened their eyes, that I find myself returning to whenever I think about what daily life in this period actually felt like on a human level. It is not dramatic. There are no speeches attached to it, no ceremony, no formal acknowledgement of what it meant. She simply did it every morning before the sun was up, and the rest of the household slept through it, and the room was warm by the time they woke. The unwitnessed labour, the effort that makes all other effort possible. I think about how many things in any household, in any family, in any era, operate on this principle. The thing that happens before everyone else is awake, the maintenance work that is invisible because it is done before visibility is possible, the fire that is already going when you come downstairs, so to speak. Someone lit it. Someone always lit it. In the medieval household, this was not an abstraction. It was the actual fire, and it had to be done every single day, because if it was not done, if the coals had gone out entirely during the night, if the rekindling failed, the consequences were real and immediate and required solving before anything else. A dead hearth in a medieval home was not a minor inconvenience. Fire was not easily obtained from scratch. There were no matches. I want to say that plainly because it is a fact that sounds simple and lands with much more weight the longer you sit with it. There were no matches. The friction match was not commercially available until the 1820s. The phosphorus match, the kind you could strike on any surface, did not become widely available until the second half of the 19th century. For the entirety of the medieval period and well into the early modern era, starting a fire from nothing required one of two things: a tinderbox or a neighbour. A tinderbox was a small metal container that held the materials for fire starting. A piece of steel, a piece of flint and tinder, dried moss, charred cloth, fine dried fungus, anything that would catch a spark and hold it long enough to be coaxed into flame. Striking flint against steel produces sparks. Those sparks had to land on the tinder, and the tinder had to be positioned and blown upon with sufficient patience and skill to produce an ember, and the ember then transferred to the prepared kindling. In dry conditions, with good materials and a practiced hand, this could be accomplished in a few minutes. In damp conditions, with indifferent materials, it could take considerably longer. It could fail. Which is why the neighbour was the other option. If your fire went out, you went to the nearest house where a fire was burning and you brought home an ember, carried in a clay pot or an iron vessel, cupped against the cold, a live ember borrowed from someone else's hearth to restart your own. This borrowing was common enough that it was a recognised social act, embedded in the fabric of village life. It also meant that the community's fires were interconnected in a literal way. Your warmth tonight might be partly descended from a coal borrowed from the house at the end of the lane 3 winters ago. I find something remarkable in that. The way warmth passed between households, physically, materially, not as a metaphor but as an actual glowing coal carried through the cold. But this is why she was so careful with the banking. This is why it mattered so much that the fire was set correctly before sleep. Because losing the fire was not simply cold. It was a problem to be solved at the expense of time and effort and the obligation of going to a neighbour at an inconvenient hour. It was a failure, in a quiet and practical sense, of stewardship. She kept the fire. That was her work in the dark of the morning, and it was the foundation on which the entire day rested. Now let us talk about what she was working toward. Because rekindling the fire was not the end of the morning's first labour, it was the beginning. The fire was needed for warmth, yes, but it was also needed for breakfast, for the morning porridge that was the primary morning meal of the medieval peasant household, and that had to be made before the rest of the household began to stir. Pottage. The word sounds faintly amusing to modern ears, a slightly comic word for something simple. What it actually was is more interesting than the word suggests. Pottage was a cooked grain, or vegetable porridge, usually oats or barley, sometimes peas, thickened with whatever was available and flavoured with whatever the household's herb bundles and kitchen garden and autumn's preservation had provided. It was not the same every morning. It changed with the season, with what was available, with what had been used the day before and what remained. In summer, pottage might have fresh greens stirred into it, nettles, sorrel, wild garlic gathered from the hedgerows, a sprig of the herbs growing near the cottage door. In winter it was thicker, denser, made from dried peas and stored grain, and whatever root vegetables had survived in the earthen storage pit beneath the floor, or in the stone-floored undercroft if the household had one. A piece of salt pork if there was any, a scraping of lard if there was not, an egg if the chickens were laying, a piece of hard cheese crumbled over the top. The pottage pot sat over the fire on a trivet or hung from the iron pot hook suspended from a bar across the hearth, which was the medieval kitchen's primary piece of cooking infrastructure. The pot hook allowed the pot to be raised or lowered, moved closer to the flame or further from it, a crude but effective form of heat control. An experienced cook knew the fire's behaviour, knew where it burned hottest, knew how to adjust the height of the pot, knew how long the porridge needed to cook before it was ready and before it was ruined. She tended the fire and stirred the pot and watched the light outside begin to change. It happened slowly. Medieval England had no window that let in the sunrise the way a modern house might. A picture window facing east, a skylight, a glass door to the garden. The window shutter was still closed against the cold. The change in light came as a general lightening of the darkness, a shift from absolute black to something that admitted shape and shadow, perceived through the thatch, through the gaps in the wattle, through the particular quality of the silence that preceded birdsong. And then the birdsong. This, I think, is something she knew the way she knew the fire. Not consciously, not as a thing she listened for, but in the body. The first bird, then a second, then a gathering of sound that built from the east outward, following the light, a slow chorus that filled the air outside and reached through the thatch into the room where she knelt by the fire, stirring the pot, listening to the world wake up. The family began to stir. Children first, often. Small children are early risers, a fact that has not changed across the centuries, and the smell of warm pottage and the increasing light and the sound of the birds were enough to lift even a tired child from sleep. They would have come to the fire gradually, a small figure in a rough linen shift, sleep-heavy, padding across the cold rushes to the warmth, and then simply standing near her for a moment without speaking, absorbing the warmth, arriving into the morning. This image, the sleepy child arriving at the morning fire, the mother stirring the pot, the day not yet begun in any formal sense. This is an image that has not changed in its essential nature across an enormous span of human time. It is one of the oldest human images there is. It predates this cottage by thousands of years. And there is something in that, something in the recognition that this particular configuration, warmth, morning, a small person finding its way to the person tending the fire, has been happening every day across human existence, that I find genuinely moving. Not as nostalgia, as connection. Now. The husband would rise after the children in many households, though this varied considerably depending on the nature of the season's work. In the pressing weeks of harvest or planting, both adults would be moving before the full light, every available minute of daylight already spoken for. In the quieter months of deep winter, the morning might have a slower quality. The fire a little longer settled into before the outside work began, the porridge eaten with less hurry. The eating itself was communal and simple. Wooden bowls, not ceramic for most households at this level, because fired pottery was more expensive than carved wood. Wooden spoons. The pottage portioned out by her into the bowls passed around, the family seated on the bench or the stools near the fire eating together. There was no table setting in the modern sense, no arrangement of dishes and cutlery and place settings. The bowl was everything. You held it, you ate from it. When it was empty, you were finished. Salt was the one condiment that mattered, and it mattered enormously. Salt was not cheap. It was not simply there, the way it is in every modern kitchen, the shaker on the counter that you use without thinking. Salt had to be purchased or traded for, and it had to be stored carefully in a dry place because it absorbed moisture and clumped and became unusable if handled badly. A household salt supply was managed with attention. It was used in cooking, in preserving meat and fish for the winter, and at the table in small, careful amounts. If a family had salt for the morning's pottage, they were managing adequately. If they did not, they were in a difficult stretch. These were the gradations of ordinary medieval prosperity. Not great and small, not wealthy and destitute, but the thousand smaller calibrations of adequacy and shortage that a family navigated from season to season, year to year. Do we have salt? Is there meat in the pot? Did the hens lay this morning? Is there enough grain stored to last until the next harvest? Are we managing? This morning, the morning we are imagining, they are managing. There is pottage, there is salt. The fire is burning well and the room is warm and the birds are fully in their chorus outside and the children are awake and eating and the day is beginning. She refills a bowl. She looks out at the morning light coming through the gap around the window shutter. A thin strip of pale grey growing gradually, almost imperceptibly lighter. By the time the shutter is opened, the household will be in the full business of the day. There will be the animals to tend, the water to fetch from the well or the stream, the field work if the season demands it, the endless small maintenance tasks of a home with no mechanical assistance and no margin for neglect. But right now, just for this moment, the morning is quiet and the fire is good and the pottage is warm. I want to ask you something about this first hour. That first hour before the household is fully awake, before the day has made its demands, before the world outside has found you. Most of us still have some version of it. Maybe it is very short. Maybe it is simply the walk from the bedroom to the kitchen, the electric kettle, the few minutes before anyone else is up. But there is usually something, some small window between waking and the day's beginning. What do you do with yours? I ask, because I think there is something in the medieval woman's relationship to that first hour that is worth noticing. She was not alone in it for pleasure. She was alone in it because the work was there and had to be done. She was not meditating or journaling or doing anything that would be given a name in a modern wellness context. She was rekindling the fire and stirring the pot and waiting for the light. And yet, and I have thought about this quite a lot, there is something that looks, from this distance, like a particular kind of peace in that. The work had a clear purpose. The purpose was warmth and breakfast. The achievement was visible and immediate and necessary. There is a specific satisfaction available in work whose results you can feel in the room around you, whose success is measured by whether the fire is burning and whether the pot is warm. She did not have to wonder whether what she was doing mattered. It mattered. The evidence was everywhere, in the warm breath of the sleeping children, in the orange glow of the revived fire, in the smell of the pottage beginning to thicken and rise. It mattered, and she was the one who made it matter every single morning before anyone else opened their eyes. Outside, the village was beginning to wake, smoke rising from the roof thole of the cottage next door, a dog barking somewhere on the lane, the sound of a door, the sound of footsteps on the cold ground, the village assembling itself from the darkness, household by household, fire by fire, each one a small warm centre recovering from the night. Inside this cottage, the pottage is ready, the family is eating, the morning has begun. And somewhere underneath all the morning's ordinary labour, the day is already arranging itself. The field work, the market, the obligations of the season, the structure of the hours between sunrise and the curfew bell that would bring them back inside again at evening. We will follow them through that day. But first, for just a moment, stay here at the morning fire. The bowl is warm in your hands. The room smells of smoke and porridge and early light. This is where the day begins. This is how it has always begun. The door opened and the world came in. Not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony. The door of a medieval peasant cottage was low enough that most adults had to duck to pass through it, a concession to the physics of thatched roof construction, rather than to any idea about keeping the cold out, though the lowness helped with that too. You bent your head and you stepped through, and then you were outside, and the outside was all of it at once. The cold air, the smell of the village, the sound of the lane, the morning light now fully arrived and doing what morning light in England does, which is generally to provide a thin, clear, grey-bright illumination that makes everything look very real and not quite warm. Medieval village life was organised around the open field system, and I want to explain what that actually meant because it is genuinely different from anything in our modern experience of land and farming and ownership, and without it the daily life of a peasant household makes almost no sense. Imagine that the arable land surrounding a village is divided not into individual private farms, with fences and hedges and clear boundaries, but into 2 or 3 enormous fields, each one composed of dozens of narrow strips of cultivated ground. Each family in the village holds a number of these strips, not clustered together, but scattered across the fields, interleaved with the strips belonging to other families, to the Lord, to the church. In any given field, your land is next to your neighbour's, which is next to someone else's, which is next to a strip held by a family on the other side of the village entirely. This sounds inefficient. In some ways it was. But it had a logic built on equity and mutual dependence that becomes clear once you understand the medieval landscape. The strips were distributed so that each family held some of the good ground, the higher, better draining soil, and some of the less good ground, the lower, damper areas that were harder to cultivate. No one family held all the best land. The distribution was the community's way of ensuring that the variability of the landscape was shared rather than hoarded. And there was something else, the animals. After the harvest, the fields were thrown open to common grazing. Every family's animals, their cattle, their pigs, their geese, could move through the stripped and harvested ground, eating the stubble, manuring as they went. The dung from those animals was the fertilizer that made next year's planting possible. The grazing was communal, and the manuring was communal, and the benefit of it belonged to everyone. The medieval village was, in this very practical agricultural sense, a collective enterprise. A family could not easily succeed in isolation because the system was not built for isolation. You needed your neighbours to harvest before you did, so their animals would not stray into your standing grain. You needed access to the common pasture for your animals, which was managed by the village as a whole. You needed the cooperation of everyone who held strips in the same field when it came time to plough, because the plough teams were often shared, a single plough requiring 8 oxen to pull it in the heavy English clay, and almost no individual family owned 8 oxen, so they pooled their animals and worked together and divided the ploughing time. The economy of the village was built on interdependence. This is the world she was moving through when she stepped out the door in the morning, not into a landscape of private property and individual effort, but into a web of mutual obligation and shared resource, a community where almost everyone knew almost everything about almost everyone else's material circumstances, because those circumstances were visible, and because they were so closely bound together that one household's difficulty was likely to affect others. She had tasks outside the cottage. Women's work in the medieval period is often described in history books as primarily domestic. The cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the spinning and weaving and mending. And all of that is true, but it is incomplete. Women in peasant households also worked in the fields, especially at harvest time when all available hands were needed and the weather created its own deadline. They tended the kitchen garden, the small plot of ground directly adjacent to the cottage that was her particular domain, planted with the vegetables and herbs the household used most, leeks and onions and cabbages and peas, the herbs for cooking and for medicine, the plants that filled out the pottage pot through the seasons. They fetched water. Every household in a medieval village fetched water. There was no running water, no well in the kitchen, no pipe. Water came from the village well or from the nearest stream or river, and it was carried, in wooden buckets or clay pots or leather vessels, from the source to the cottage, as many trips as were needed. Water for cooking, water for washing, water for the animals. This was not a task that happened once in a morning and was finished. It happened multiple times a day, in all weather, carrying the weight of it from wherever the water was to wherever it was needed. They also kept animals, chickens almost certainly, and the keeping of chickens is not nothing. They need feeding, their eggs need collecting, their housing needs managing, their population needs culling in the autumn, when the winter feed cannot support the full flock. Many households also kept a pig, the medieval peasant's primary meat animal, raised through the spring and summer on kitchen scraps and forage, and slaughtered in late autumn, when the cold made preservation easier and the animal had reached its best weight. The keeping of the pig, the daily management of its needs, was women's work in most medieval households. And then there was the spinning. Spinning was constant, continuous. It happened in every free moment, while watching the children play near the cottage, while sitting with neighbours in the afternoon, while walking to the well, while sitting by the fire in the evening. A spindle and a bundle of prepared wool could be picked up and set down a dozen times a day, each session adding another few yards of spun thread to the growing supply. Thread was the raw material of cloth, and cloth was the raw material of clothing, and clothing was not something you bought in a shop. It was something you made from the wool of the sheep, through the long chain of shearing and washing and carding and spinning and weaving and finishing. Each step in that chain was work, skilled work, and the women of the household were responsible for most of it. A medieval family's clothing was quite literally the product of years of labour. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think we tend to pass over it too quickly in the direction of the history of textiles, which becomes abstracted and economic, and I want to keep it human for a moment. The shirt on a man's back in the 14th century was spun by hands he knew, usually the hands of his wife or his mother or his daughters. The blanket the children slept under was made thread by thread over months or years, pulled through a loom by someone in this family or traded from someone in the village. Every piece of cloth in the household had a history of human effort attached to it. This is why cloth was valuable in a way that is genuinely difficult to internalize from inside our world of inexpensive, manufactured clothing. When a medieval peasant family's possessions were inventoried at death, and these inventories survive, giving us one of our most direct windows into what ordinary people actually owned, the cloth and clothing listed were often among the most valuable items in the household. A good blanket, a length of undyed wool. These were things worth recording because they represented significant investment of labour. She knew this. She did not think about it in those terms because it was simply the nature of things, and the language of economics had not yet built the vocabulary for it. But she knew the value of the blanket in the specific sense of knowing how many hours of spinning were braided into its warmth. The village sound during the day was layered. I find myself wanting to give you the soundtrack of a medieval afternoon, because I think sound is one of the ways we most powerfully inhabit a time and place we cannot visit, and the sounds of a medieval village are genuinely different from the sounds of any modern environment in ways that matter. There were animals everywhere, not in the modern agricultural sense of animals kept in separate enclosed facilities, out of sight and out of hearing. These were animals that lived in and around the village. Pigs rooting along the lane, geese moving through the open ground around the cottages in their particular bossy manner, cattle lowing from the common pasture, the occasional horse, dogs, always dogs, moving between households, serving as informal alarm systems and waste disposal both. The soundscape of the medieval village included all of these constantly as a kind of ongoing bass note beneath everything else. There were the sounds of work, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood somewhere nearby, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer from the forge if the village was large enough to have one. That particular ringing sound that carries a long way and that people today most often associate with Christmas or fairy tales, but that was simply the sound of daily metalwork, the repair of plough parts and the making of hooks and the shoeing of animals that kept the agricultural economy functional, the sound of women's voices talking while they worked, gathered at the well or sitting near each other's cottages in the afternoon if the weather permitted, spinning together. The conversation at the well was important. It was not idle, it was not merely social, though it was social too. The exchange of information that happened when women gathered at the shared water source was one of the primary news channels of the village. Who was ill? Whose field looked bad this season? Whether the miller was giving fair weight? Whether the Lord's reeve had been seen counting the strips again? What was happening with the family at the end of the lane whose husband had not been seen working for a week? This information was practical and was managed with the seriousness it deserved. Because in a world without newspapers or public notices or any other mechanism for the circulation of community information, conversation was how knowledge travelled. She knew her neighbours the way that is almost impossible to achieve in most modern contexts. Not because she liked them all. Some of them she did not particularly like, but she knew them, their habits, their difficulties, their capacities, their particular way of managing or failing to manage, what they had and what they lacked. This knowledge was not gossip in the diminished sense the word has acquired. It was social information that enabled the community to function, that allowed the informal systems of mutual aid, the borrowing of an ember, the help at harvest, the shared care of a sick family, to operate because people knew who needed what and who could provide it. The village was a small world, and like all small worlds it had its full complement of human complication, the neighbour who did not do their fair share of the common work, the dispute about the boundary between strips that had been going on since before anyone could remember, the family whose pig persistently escaped into other people's gardens, the occasional accusation at the manor court that one person had taken more from the common wood than their entitlement allowed. These were not exceptional events. They were the texture of daily village life, the friction generated by people living in very close material proximity with shared resources and overlapping claims. The manor court met periodically, often 4 times a year, and it was in many ways the village's primary governance mechanism for exactly these disputes. The reeve, the elected representative of the village tenants, managed the daily agricultural organisation. The Hayward kept track of the common pasture. The ale taster checked that anyone selling ale in the village was producing it to acceptable quality, which was both a public health regulation and a revenue mechanism for the Lord. These institutions were not remote or abstract. They were your neighbours sitting in a hall deciding whether your pig had damaged someone's grain and what you owed for it. The afternoon light in England in this period, in the 14th century, in any season but midsummer, was a limited and precious resource. The days were short, in winter genuinely dramatically short. Sunrise after 8 in the morning, sunset before 4 in the afternoon, less than 8 hours of workable daylight in the depths of December and January. Every task that required good light had to be accomplished within those hours. The work did not stop for darkness, but it changed. The outdoor work ceased. The indoor work continued by firelight and rushlight, as long as the family could sustain it. This is one of the ways in which the medieval experience of time was genuinely different from ours, not simply slower but differently bounded. The day ended when the light ended, in a way that is not metaphorical but entirely literal. The darkness was real and complete, and it shut work down as surely as a closing door. And when the light went, the family came back inside. She was often first back because her work, the fire, the pot, the preparation of the evening meal, required her to be inside before the others, but also perhaps because the cottage was hers in a way the fields were not. The fields were shared and contested and governed by a dozen overlapping claims and obligations. The cottage was the household's, and within it she was the organising authority. The person who decided where things were kept, how the fire was managed, what was in the pot, how the children's day was structured, what tasks were done and in what order. This authority was not named. It was not given a title or recognised in the documentary record in any formal way, but it was real. In the daily management of a medieval peasant household, the woman of the house was the operational centre, not the head of the household in the legal or social sense, that belonged to her husband in all the ways that the formal structures of medieval life assigned it there. But the practical intelligence of the home, the person whose knowledge of where the food was and how long it would last and what needed to be done tomorrow, and which child was coming down with something, that was her. She moved back through the low door into the cottage's warmth as the afternoon light began to flatten and cool. The fire needed attention. The evening pottage needed to be started. The children needed gathering. The day was not over, but the quality of it was changing. Outside, the village was beginning its own evening movement. Animals coming in, neighbours calling to each other across lanes. The general contraction of activity that preceded darkness. The sounds of the afternoon gave way to something quieter, more interior. Inside the cottage, the fire was built up again, not banked, burning properly, because there was still cooking to do and light needed, and the room needed to come back to warmth after the hours when it had been holding heat alone without the help of any human tending. She looked at what was in the pot. She looked at what was left in the storage, the grain, the dried peas, the roots. She made calculations. These calculations were not written down. They lived entirely in her head, updated constantly, adjusted for what had been used and what was available, and what could be supplemented by the kitchen garden, or the hedgerow, or the neighbour's occasional generosity. Managing a medieval household's food supply was a continuous exercise in practical mathematics, conducted under conditions of genuine uncertainty. Because the harvest was never fully secure, the winter was always of uncertain duration, and the margin between adequate and insufficient was often very narrow. She stirred the pot. The children came in from the lane loud with the news of the afternoon. And the evening began to settle over the village like something slow and warm and absolute. Let us talk about food. Not as a historical survey, not as a list of what medieval people ate organised by social class and region and century. I want to talk about it the way she thought about it, which is to say practically and urgently, and with a constant awareness of what was there and what was not, and what the gap between them meant. The medieval peasant diet has a reputation for being poor, and in some respects that reputation is earned. In the bad years, the years after a failed harvest, the years following the devastating famines of the early 14th century, the years when moraine took the cattle or wet weather ruined the grain standing in the field, people went hungry. Actually, hungry. Hungry in a way that left physical evidence in the skeletal remains that archaeologists recover from medieval burial sites. Stunted growth, nutritional deficiency, the bone-deep record of a body that did not receive enough through the critical growing years. That is the truth, and it should not be softened. But in the ordinary years, in the years that were neither the worst nor the best, the peasant diet was different from poor in the way that word is most commonly used. It was limited. Monotonous by our standards. Dependent on grain and legumes and whatever the season provided in ways that connected the family's table very directly to the surrounding land. But it was not always insufficient, and it contained, in its best and most ordinary form, things that were genuinely nourishing and that the people who ate them prepared with real knowledge and real skill. Bread was the foundation. Not the bread you are thinking of, not the light, soft, quickly made sandwich bread, not the sourdough boule from the artisan bakery. Medieval peasant bread was made primarily from a mixture of rye and wheat, or sometimes rye alone, or barley, depending on what the family strips produced and what the local soil would grow. It was dense, it was heavy. It was darker than any bread in most modern kitchens, and it had a flavour that was specifically itself, slightly sour from the leaven, deeply grain-forward, with a crust that the long baking in a sealed earthen or stone oven produced to a hardness that had its own utility. Hard bread did not go stale quickly. In a world without refrigeration, and without the kind of preservatives that keep modern bread soft for a week, this mattered enormously. A loaf that stayed edible for several days rather than 1 or 2 was a practical advantage. The hardness also made it useful in ways that soft bread is not. The manchet, the thick slice of stale bread used as a plate for more liquid foods, was the medieval peasant's answer to the dish, and it worked perfectly well, and when the meal was over it was eaten too. Bread was baked not every day in most households, but in batches, once a week or once every few days, in quantities that would sustain the family until the next baking. The village that had a communal oven, which many did, a large stone or clay oven shared between households, heated by burning a load of wood inside it and then cleared and loaded with the family's prepared loaves in sequence, organised baking days as a community event, each household bringing their shaped loaves in their own vessels, each one knowing which loaves were theirs. The baker's task, in a household without access to a communal oven, was to manage a small dome-shaped clay or stone structure, sometimes built adjacent to the hearth, sometimes a separate construction outside the cottage, heated carefully and then sealed with the bread inside, getting the temperature right, enough heat to bake the loaf through without burning it, sustained evenly for the full baking time, was skill that required practice and knowledge. A well-baked loaf was a genuine achievement. An overbaked or underbaked loaf was a waste of the grain it contained, and grain was not wasted. Ale. Medieval English peasants drank ale, and this fact tends to produce a certain kind of modern response. A slight smirk. The assumption that everyone in the Middle Ages was perpetually mildly drunk, that the ale was the reason the period seemed simultaneously productive and chaotic. The truth is both less colourful and more interesting. Ale was drunk because water was unreliable. Not everywhere, not always, not every source. But the village well and the nearby stream were both shared with animals and received runoff from fields and human habitation, and in a world without water treatment or germ theory, the contamination risk was real and genuinely dangerous. Ale, in the process of its fermentation, became safer to drink than the water it was made from. The alcohol content was low. Medieval ale was weak by modern standards, the standard household ale being perhaps 2 to 3%, brewed to be consumed daily rather than to produce intoxication. Children drank it. Labourers drank it while working. It was the beverage of daily life the way water is ours. The ale brewing was typically women's work, and in many villages the women who brewed ale for their households also sold the surplus, becoming the alewife, the cottage ale producer who supplied the neighbourhood from her home. The ale taster mentioned earlier, the manor court official who checked the quality and price of ale sold in the village, was partly checking the alewife's product, ensuring it met the standards set by the Assize of Ale, the royal regulation that governed pricing and quality of ale across England from the 13th century onward. This was, in a quiet way, a significant economic activity. The alewife ran a small business from her kitchen, using the same equipment, the large pot, the fire, that she used for everything else. The income was her income, or her household's income, earned through her knowledge and her labour and sold to her neighbours. In the village economy, this mattered. Now let's go back to the pot. The pottage pot was the centre of the medieval peasant kitchen, and the pottage that came from it across the year was not a single dish, but a whole range of preparations that changed with the seasons, in ways that were both practically driven and genuinely varied. Spring pottage was different from winter pottage not merely in temperature but in character. The fresh greens of spring, the young nettles and sorrel and wild garlic, changed the flavour and texture of the dish into something genuinely different from the thick, dense, grain-forward porridge of midwinter. She knew which plants were edible. This is worth saying plainly because we have lost this knowledge so completely that most modern adults genuinely cannot look at a patch of mixed vegetation and identify what can and cannot be eaten from it. She could, not as a specialist skill but as ordinary literacy. The plants of the hedgerow and the field margins and the wood edge were a resource she could read, and she read them constantly, adjusting the household's diet to what was available at each point in the seasonal cycle. Nettles, picked young in spring before they became tough and bitter. Sorrel, its sharp sourness a genuine flavour contribution to an otherwise grain-dominated diet. Elderberries in late summer, made into a rough syrup or dried. Wild garlic in the shaded patches near water. Mushrooms, gathered with the specific knowledge of which were edible and which were not, knowledge that a single mistake could teach you in the most severe possible way. The kitchen garden supplied the domestic herbs, the thyme and sage and rosemary and parsley that went into the pottage, not as seasoning in the modern sense, but as flavour, nutrition, and medicine all at once. Medieval herb use did not distinguish clearly between cooking and medicine. Many of the same plants served both purposes, and the woman of the household was the herbalist in the most basic practical sense, the person who knew what plant addressed what ailment, and grew it within arm's reach of her kitchen for exactly that reason. Mint for stomach complaints, chamomile for fever and to help sleep. Rue, which had a dozen uses and was kept with equal parts practical knowledge and cultural caution because its applications overlapped in some uncomfortable directions that the medical and spiritual authorities of the period kept a watchful eye on. Lavender for headaches, and to scent the linens if there were any. Comfrey for wounds, its leaves applied as poultice with genuine efficacy. Modern herbalists know now what she understood from experience, that comfrey contains allantoin, a compound that promotes cell growth and wound healing. She grew her medicine. It hung from the rafters with the onions and the dried mushrooms. It sat in the pottage pot and in the cup of warm infused water she made for a child who was not feeling well. The knowledge that managed it was hers, passed from her mother and her mother's mother, updated constantly by experience and by the informal exchange of information that happened whenever women gathered. Meat was a luxury in the sense of frequency, not in the sense of complete absence. The autumn slaughter, Martinmas, around the 11th of November, was one of the significant events in the peasant household's year. Animals that could not be fed through the winter were killed and preserved, and this process generated the household's primary supply of animal protein for the months ahead. The pig, if the household had one, was the central figure of this. Every part of the animal was used, the laird rendered for cooking and for the rushlights, the organs eaten immediately, the hams and shoulders salted down in brine or smoked over the fire for preservation, the trotters and ears used in broth, the blood made into black pudding, the intestines cleaned and used as sausage casing. Nothing was wasted. The phrase has become a cliché in modern food culture, a wistful ideal about sustainability and respect for ingredients. In the medieval peasant household, it was simply the operating reality, driven by the knowledge that what was thrown away could not be recovered. She knew this in the bone. Every scrap of rendered fat was saved for the rushlights. Every bone was boiled for broth. The cooking liquid from the pottage was not poured away. It was used again, or given to the chickens. The stale bread that was too hard to eat was soaked in that liquid, and became something edible again. The resourcefulness was total, not aspirational, simply real. Fasting also shaped the year's eating in ways that are easy to underestimate. The medieval Christian calendar imposed fasting requirements that, in aggregate, covered a substantial portion of the year. Fridays were always fast days, no meat, limited food. Saturdays in many traditions, the full 40 days of Lent, various vigils and holy days scattered through the year. In total, something approaching a third of all days in the year were days on which meat was restricted or forbidden. This was not experienced primarily as deprivation. It was simply the rhythm of the year, as natural as the rhythm of the seasons, and it shaped the diet in ways that built genuine skill in fish-based and legume-based cooking, because on fast days the protein had to come from somewhere, and dried salt fish, the herring that came inland from the coastal trade in enormous quantities, and dried or fresh peas and beans and lentils were the answers. Herring in medieval England is worth pausing on this. The North Sea herring fishery supplied much of Northern Europe's protein for the non-meat days of the medieval Christian calendar. Dried and salted in vast quantities by the fishing communities of the English and Dutch and Scandinavian coasts, herring moved inland through a trade network that reached even quite small and landlocked villages. It was cheap, it was preserved and could be stored for months. It smelled powerfully of itself. And for the medieval peasant household on a fast day, it was protein, and protein on a fast day was a practical matter that the smell could not make irrelevant. She could cook it in a dozen ways, with the mustard made from the seeds grown in the kitchen garden, with leeks from the winter store, with the garlic that survived the cold in its braided ropes against the cottage wall. Cooking in a medieval peasant household was not the application of a recipe book. There were no recipe books. It was knowledge, built from practice and from teaching, and from the long experience of what worked and what did not, what stretched the available ingredients furthest, what the family would actually eat and what they would leave in the bowl. She cooked for people she knew completely. She knew their preferences and their limitations and their health and their hunger. She adjusted accordingly. The child who would not eat onions, the husband who needed more of the high-energy grain dishes in the heavy work weeks, the elder who could no longer manage the hardest bread. This knowledge was not recorded anywhere. It simply operated quietly in every decision she made about the pot. The evening meal was the main meal of the day, not the largest necessarily, some pottage is pottage, and the quantities were what they were, but the longest. The one eaten together, at the end of the day's labour, in the firelight, with the work behind them and the night ahead. It had a quality of conclusion to it that the morning's eaten on one's feet breakfast did not. They sat. They ate slowly. The children talked about the day's small events. The adults, tired, let the conversation move where it would. This is one of the domestic pleasures that the historical record is not very good at capturing. The quality of a meal eaten at the end of a long shared day, by a fire, in a small warm room. The specific satisfaction of it. the way fatigue can become a kind of ease when the work is done and the warmth is real and the bowl in your hands is full. The pottage tasted of leeks and barley, and the salt that had been carefully measured into it. It tasted of the kitchen garden in mid-season, of the herbs she had hung to dry in July and taken down in November, of the small domestic skill that had turned the available ingredients into something that sustained the people it was made for. It was good, not fine, not elaborate, good. Good in the way that things are good when they are exactly what they are supposed to be. Adequate to the cold and the tiredness and the length of the day, warm in the bowl and in the body, made with knowledge and care for the people who needed it. Outside, the evening had fully arrived. The light was gone. The village was quiet now, with the particular quiet of places without artificial light, the deep quiet of actual darkness, broken only by the wind in the thatch and the occasional sound of an animal from the pen. Inside, the bowls were empty, the fire was low, the children's eyes were closing. The night was coming, and with it, the particular texture of an evening in a medieval cottage, the prayers, the storytelling, the small rituals before sleep that every family in every century has found its own version of. That is where we are going next. The curfew bell rang at dusk. Not every village had a bell tower. Not every parish church had a bell of sufficient size to carry across the fields and the lanes to every household's hearing. But enough did, and the practice was widespread enough across medieval England, that the curfew bell, the couvre-feu, from the French, cover the fire, was one of the organising sounds of peasant life in the evening hours, an instruction cast in iron and suspended above the village. Cover your fire, come inside, the day is done. The word curfew has survived into our own time wearing different clothes. We use it now as a restriction, a prohibition, most commonly applied to young people. You must be home by this hour, you must be off the streets, the authority says so, and the authority will respond if you are not. The medieval curfew was something more practical and less punitive than that. It was fire safety. Consider what a village built of wattle and daub and thatched roofs represented as a fire hazard. Dry thatch, closely packed buildings, no water main, no fire brigade, no mechanism for fighting a serious fire once it had taken hold beyond the human chain of neighbours with buckets, running between the well and the blaze, trying to contain what was almost certainly already uncontainable. A fire in one cottage in a medieval village could take the whole lane in minutes. The curfew, the covering of the fire, the banking and damping of the hearth at the end of the day, was a genuine community safety measure. The bell was a reminder. Not come home or face consequences, but cover your fire. Be careful. Remember that your fire is not only yours. There is something in this that I keep returning to. The fire in the medieval village was at once the most private and the most communally consequential thing a household possessed. It was the centre of the home, the source of its warmth and its cooking and its light. And yet it was a fire, and fire does not respect property lines, and a household that did not manage its fire carefully could harm its neighbours in the most devastating possible way. The bell was the community speaking to each household about its responsibilities, not to the law, not to the Lord, though the Lord was certainly interested in keeping his village from burning down, to each other, to the family next door. She heard the bell and she banked the fire. Not extinguished. Banked. The careful arrangement of the coals and the larger pieces of fuel that would keep the fire alive at its lowest possible level through the night. Breathing slowly, neither burning freely nor going cold. The skill in banking a fire well is knowing how much to damp it. Too much, and it goes out. Too little, and it burns through the night at a level that wastes fuel and poses risk. The right balance was a judgment call made with the hands and the eyes, adjusted for the size of the coals, the type of wood, the temperature of the air in the room. She had made this judgment hundreds of times, thousands of times by the time she was a woman of middle years. The banked fire was as familiar to her as her own breathing. Now the room changed again. The fire banked low, a small orange pulse in the centre of the hearth, not the evening's full flame, and the tallow candle on the table became the primary light source. One candle, its flame small and steady in the still air of the closed cottage, casting its particular orange circle of visibility and leaving the walls in shadow and the ceiling entirely dark. The smell of the candle was present but not overwhelming. Tallow candles smelled of the animal they came from. Not strongly, not offensively by the standards of a room that already smelled of smoke and rushes and the evening's cooking, but distinctly. A warm, faintly fatty smell that was part of the sensory vocabulary of every indoor evening in this period, the way the particular smell of a particular brand of coffee might anchor a morning in your own life. The candle was not burned carelessly. She managed it with the same economy she brought to everything else in the household. The wick needed occasional attention, pinched back with damp fingers when it began to gutter, or trimmed with small scissors if the household had them, or bitten clean if it did not. A properly maintained wick burned steadily and slowly. A neglected wick ran, smoking and wasting itself faster than it needed to. The candle would burn for 2 or 3 hours if managed well. After that, the only light would be the fire. 2 or 3 hours of candlelight. This was the evening. Let us sit inside it for a moment. The children were still awake, though the youngest was close to sleep, propped against an adult, or settled on a pallet near the hearth, eyes half open, present in a drowsy, unfocused way. The older children, perhaps 8, 10, 12, were awake and involved in the evening in whatever way the household's needs permitted. In families where the children were old enough to help, evening was a continuation of productive work. Older children carded wool, the process of combing raw fleece between 2 wooden-handled wire pads to align the fibres for spinning. It was not difficult work, but it required steady hands and patience, and it could be done by firelight and candlelight well enough if your eyes were young. She might be spinning while a daughter carded, the 2 tasks working in tandem, each producing the material the other needed. Or mending. The clothing of a medieval household was always in need of repair, because clothing was too valuable to discard when it could be fixed. A torn hem, a worn elbow, a seam coming apart. These were addressed immediately rather than allowed to progress, because a small repair cost much less thread and time than a large one. She sewed by candlelight with the needle and thread she kept in a small leather or wooden case, one of the few entirely personal possessions that appears in the records across all periods as something women owned specifically and individually. The needle was important. Small needles were not easy to make or to replace. A bent or broken needle was a minor household crisis. You treated the needle with the care it deserved. Now, the husband. In the evening, after the day's outdoor work and the evening meal, the men of peasant households also worked, though the nature of the work differed. Small repairs, a tool handle needing replacement, a harness needing mending, a piece of equipment that would be needed tomorrow and had to be seen to tonight. Larger households with more complex agricultural needs had more of this. In the quieter periods of the year there might simply be rest, sitting near the fire, perhaps whittling, perhaps talking, perhaps simply absorbing the warmth in the way that a body thoroughly used by a day's physical labour absorbs warmth with a gratitude that is almost philosophical. There would have been talking. I want to dwell on this because I think we underestimate how central conversation was to the evening, in a world without alternative entertainment. No book for most of this population, literacy was not common among the peasantry, and even those who could read had access to very few texts. No radio, no music box, no instrument in most households, though a pipe or a drum might appear in a better provisioned home or among the families of skilled musicians. What there was, in the evening by the fire, was each other. The conversation of the medieval peasant family in the evening is not recorded, obviously. The daily conversation of ordinary people is never recorded in any period. We know the great speeches and the court proceedings and the letters of the literate, and the rest is silence. But the social world of the medieval village was not a silent one, and the evening was when the more leisurely talking happened. The day reviewed, the tomorrow planned, the small social news of the village exchanged, the complaints and observations and bits of information that constitute the ongoing conversation of any close community. And then there was the storytelling. This is where the evening fire in a medieval cottage becomes something that I genuinely find moving, in the specific way that things that connect across great distance of time can be moving. Because storytelling by firelight is old, older than medieval England by thousands of years. The practice of gathering in the dark around a source of warmth and light and telling stories, this is one of the oldest human behaviours there is. Medieval peasant families did it. The stories they told were not the great Arthurian romances of the courts, not the elaborate allegories of the literate clergy. They were the stories that circulate in every village in every culture, local legends, cautionary tales, the particular kind of story that seems to grow naturally in a community and that everyone has heard and that gets retold slightly differently by each teller. There were saints' lives, simplified, transmitted orally, shaped by the telling into something more like folklore than hagiography. The story of a local holy man or woman with its particular miracles and its particular lesson. The stories of the old faith that the church had worked to convert but never fully erased. The fairy hills and the green men and the particular spirits that lived in certain bodies of water and needed managing. The stories that explained why the old oak at the edge of the common field was never cut and what happened to the man who tried. These stories were entertainment. They were also education, the transmission of the community's knowledge and values and history through a form that was memorable, pleasurable, and requiring of no literacy at all. The child listening from the pallet near the fire was being taught something in the act of listening, even if, especially if, what was being taught was not formalized as a lesson. What was the quality of the evening light on those faces listening? A tallow candle throws orange light that moves. It does not illuminate steadily the way an electric light does. It breathes, and as it breathes, the faces in its circle shift slightly between light and shadow. The fire, even banked low, adds its own contribution, a deep red and orange glow from the hearth that casts the shadows in the opposite direction from the candle. The room was lit by two warm, moving sources, and what this produced was not the flat clarity of modern electrical lighting, but something more layered, more alive. Faces in this light look different from faces in modern light. The moving shadow softens features and gives everything a quality of slight animation, a sense that the room itself is breathing. It is not an unpleasant quality. It is, in fact, the quality that most of us associate intuitively with intimacy, with evenings that felt genuinely warm and human. There is a reason that candlelight is still used in restaurants and dining rooms and on dinner tables as the aesthetic of intimacy. It is because the moving, warm, slightly unsteady light does something to the experience of being with people that flat overhead lighting cannot replicate. It draws the attention inward, toward the circle, toward the faces. The medieval family did not choose this light for its aesthetic properties. They lived in it because it was the only light available. But the effect was real regardless of the intention, and the evenings by candlelight and firelight were, in whatever complicated way, genuinely intimate in the specific physical sense of a shared circle of warmth and light in a darkness that was otherwise absolute. Now let me tell you about the sounds. The sounds of a medieval cottage in the evening were specific and layered and almost entirely organic. There were no sounds from outside that resembled anything in a modern inhabited environment. No traffic, no distant mechanical hum, no overhead planes. The sounds from outside were animal and natural, the wind in the thatch, which had its own particular sound, a deep organic rustling that varied with the wind's direction and strength. The occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the village. An owl. There were many owls in medieval England, in the trees and the barn eaves and the old walls of the church, and they began their business at dusk with the particular hollow sound that has no equivalent. The sheep, if the village's flock was kept nearby, the pig in its pen, the chickens that had been closed in for the night making occasional small sounds of adjustment in the darkness. Inside, the sounds were the sounds of the family's work and presence, the rhythmic shush of the spinning spindle, the soft percussion of the carding paddles, the creak of the stool on the earth floor as someone shifted their weight, the fire settling, that sound of wood becoming coals, that small internal rearrangement that a fire makes periodically, like a sleeper turning. And underneath all of it, the breathing. Breathing is a sound we almost never register in modern environments, because the ambient noise of modern life, the HVAC system, the refrigerator, the distant traffic, drowns it out entirely. In a medieval cottage, in the late evening when the work was winding down and the children were asleep or close to it, breathing was audible, the breath of the sleeping child on the pallet, the steadier breath of the adult still awake by the candle, the slower, deeper breath that meant someone had crossed the border into sleep without quite deciding to. These sounds constitute an intimacy that is very difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. The specific closeness of being in a small warm room with the people you live with, in the dark, hearing them breathe, knowing by the sound of their breathing whether they are asleep. You knew each other in sound in the medieval household, completely, unavoidably. The way that people who live in very close proximity always know each other, not in the selective way that curated modern relationships tend to allow, where you can limit what of yourself is visible but thoroughly in the full round of daily life, its bodily realities and its emotional rhythms and its difficult as well as its easy moments. There is something that is genuinely lost in the privacy and space of modern life, and I am not proposing we go back. The cost of medieval proximity in terms of actual privacy and individual autonomy was real, and I would not wish it on anyone. But there is also something that the proximity contained that the space does not easily provide, and I think the evening breathing in the small dark room is as good a way as any to name it. You were not alone. Whatever the day had been, whatever difficulty or failure or unresolved worry, at the end of it you were not alone. The fire was there, and the family was there, and the darkness outside was held at bay by the small warm fact of shared space and shared warmth, and the slow collective breathing of people who would still be there when the morning came. The candle burned lower. She watched it, gauged it. Perhaps another half hour, perhaps less. She completed what she was doing, the last of the evening's spinning, the repair that had needed doing, and began the process of closing the household down for the night. This was not a complicated process. There was no kitchen to clean in the modern sense. The pot was set aside, not washed, to be used again in the morning. The wooden bowls were stacked. What little water remained in the household's vessel was set near the fire to be warm in the morning. The door was checked. The wooden bar that held it closed against the night dropped into its iron brackets on either side of the frame. The children who were still awake were settled into sleep. This was not as fraught a process as modern parents sometimes experience, because the children of a medieval peasant household were physically tired in a way that is genuinely different from the tiredness of modern children who have spent most of their day in sedentary activities and whose bodies have not been fully spent. A child who has been running in the lane and helping with the animals and doing their portion of the household's physical work since early morning is ready for sleep in a way that does not require persuasion. They lay down near the fire and they slept, with the particular totality of exhausted children sleeping, which any parent in any era recognizes, the deep absence of it, the way a sleeping child seems to have travelled somewhere inaccessible. She watched them for a moment. There is no record of this. No one wrote down the moment a medieval peasant woman stood by a low fire and looked at her sleeping children. But it happened. It happened in every household, every evening, in one version or another. The moment between the day's work and sleep, when the world was quiet and the children were safe and the fire was holding, and there was nothing urgent requiring action, just this. The room, the warmth, the sleeping faces. It is the oldest human image. Not the battles and the court proceedings and the great theological debates that fill the history books. This, the fire and the sleeping children and the brief stillness before sleep. She extinguished the candle. The way you extinguish a tallow candle is not to blow it out. Blowing produces a billow of foul-smelling smoke and leaves the wick glowing for an uncomfortable length of time. You pinch it, with damp fingers, quickly. Or you use a snuffer if the household had one. A small cone-shaped metal cap that dropped over the flame and starved it of air. The light went out. And then the room existed in firelight only, the banked hearth, its deep red glow, casting the faintest illumination across the floor, and the sleeping forms and the hanging bundles overhead. Enough to see shapes, not enough to see faces. The darkness had come fully in from the edges of the room, contained now only by that small warm core. She lay down, not undressed in the modern sense. She would have removed her outer garment, the overkirtle, and perhaps her shoes, and slept in her undergown, which was what she had woken in this morning, and what she would wake in again tomorrow. The bedding was whatever the household had, a straw mattress, a wool blanket, a second blanket if it was cold enough to justify using both. She arranged herself in the warmth of the sleeping family. The fire breathed, the thatch rustled in the wind, the owl outside made its hollow call. The household was asleep, and the darkness was very complete and very quiet, and the fire was the only thing awake in the room now, keeping watch in its particular way, slow and warm and patient. The same fire that had been lit before anyone else was up this morning, the same fire that had cooked the day's food and warmed the room and provided the light by which the evening's work was done. It breathed, it settled, it kept going. Outside, the village was entirely dark. No streetlight, no lit window, no glow on the horizon. The darkness above the village, above the unlit fields and the thatch roofs and the stone church tower, was the darkness of a sky with no competition. The stars, when the clouds permitted, were extraordinary. Not the washed-out suggestion of stars that most of us living in or near cities have ever seen, but the full sky. The Milky Way as a visible structure, the stars as a real presence, the moon when it rose making a shadow behind every building and tree. She did not see this tonight. She was asleep. But it was there, above the village, above the thatched rooftops from which the smoke of a dozen banked fires still curled gently into the cold air. The stars and the darkness and the silence, and below it the small, warm, inhabited grid of cottages, with their sleeping families and their breathing fires. This was England in the 14th century on an ordinary evening. Nothing had gone dramatically wrong today. No flood, no fire, no sudden illness. The harvest was in. The food stores were adequate, if not generous. The children were well. The work of today was done, and the work of tomorrow was known, and the fire would be alive in the morning. This was a good day. It was also just Tuesday. And there is something about the ordinariness of it, the way the whole elaborate, difficult, beautiful machinery of this household's survival ran as its normal condition, day in and day out, attended to by people who did not consider it exceptional, that I find myself unable to move past without pause. We are very accustomed, in our relationship to history, to looking for the exceptional, the battles, the epidemics, the famines, the dramatic events that mark the period in the textbook, and those things were real and they mattered, but so was this. The fire managed, the pottage made, the children sleeping, the candle extinguished, the darkness held at bay. Every ordinary day that a family made it through intact was its own achievement, not recorded, not celebrated, just continued. The fire breathed. The household slept. Before they slept, they prayed. Not all of them, in every household, every night, with the same form and the same completeness. Human beings are inconsistent, and the religious life of medieval peasants was not the idealized and uniform piety that some later accounts have made it appear. But prayer before sleep was, for most households in medieval Christian England, as much a part of the evening routine as banking the fire. It was simply what you did. The shape of the day included it, the way the shape of the day included the morning fire and the evening meal. The prayers they would have known were few and specific and entirely from memory. Literacy was not required, and in most cases was not present. The medieval peasants' religious education was oral, delivered from the pulpit in the vernacular, in English, because Latin was the language of the mass and the clergy, not the language in which most priests addressed their congregations, and repeated in the household. The Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed. These were the texts that the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had established as the minimum that every Christian was expected to know, and the parish clergy were charged with ensuring their parishioners had them. She knew them. She had known them since childhood, taught by her mother the way her mother had been taught. The words passed down through the household in the same way that the recipe for pottage was passed down. Not written, not formalized, simply transmitted from one generation to the next through the act of daily practice. The Lord's Prayer in Middle English, the form she would have known, was close enough to the modern version that you would recognize it immediately. The cadences are the same, the structure the same, only the vowel sounds and some of the word forms shifting across the centuries. It was a prayer designed for exactly this context, not for a scholar's study, not for a cathedral, for a person at the end of an ordinary day in a small dark room, speaking to whatever vastness lay beyond the thatch. Our Father who art in heaven. The simplicity of it, the directness, the way it does not require preparation or a particular emotional state, or the right words beyond itself. You say it, and you mean it as best you can, and the day is committed and the night is begun. The Ave Maria, Hail Mary, full of grace, was addressed to the figure who occupied, in the medieval religious imagination, a position of enormous warmth and accessibility. Mary was not a theological abstraction. She was the Mother of God, yes, but she was also, in the way that medieval popular devotion understood her, an intercessor, someone you could speak to, someone who had been, in her own life, an ordinary woman, a mother, someone who had known loss of the most absolute kind, and who therefore understood, at least in the way that the medieval peasant felt these things rather than reasoned about them, what ordinary human life felt like from the inside. The prayers she said for the children were probably addressed to Mary. I do not know this. I cannot know it. But the historical and devotional pattern of medieval women's piety, documented by historians who have worked carefully with the available evidence from wills, from pilgrimage records, from the traces of devotional practice that survive in the material and written record, suggests that Mary was the figure toward whom the most personal, the most daily, the most specific prayers tended to be directed. Not the great prayers of the liturgy, which belong to the priest and the church, the small private prayers, the ones said in the dark. Keep them safe through the night. Let the little ones cough ease. Let my husband's back hold for the harvest. Let the fire make it to morning. These were not prayers from the theology books. They were the prayers of someone who needed very specific things and addressed them to the figure who seemed most likely to understand why those particular things mattered. Now I want to say something careful here, because the religious life of the medieval peasant is a subject that attracts a certain kind of modern sentimentality that I think does the actual people a disservice. There is a version of this history that paints the medieval peasant as deeply, uniformly uncomplicated in their faith, a simple piety, a childlike trust, an uncritical acceptance of the Church's teaching that made their spiritual lives simultaneously beautiful and limited. This is not quite right. The evidence from parish records and from the records of the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts that handled matters of morals and religious observance, suggests a more complicated picture. People skipped Mass. People did not know the required prayers as well as the clergy wanted them to. People held beliefs that mixed Christian teaching with older practices that the Church had never fully succeeded in displacing. Beliefs about the properties of certain springs and trees and days, about the management of fairies and the behaviour of the dead, about remedies and protections that drew on a pre-Christian understanding of the world, without the person holding them necessarily recognising the theological problem this presented. The faith of the medieval peasant was real, but it was also lived and improvised and shaped by immediate practical need in ways that the formal doctrine did not always fully account for. She said her prayers, and she also perhaps kept a sprig of something over the door that was not exactly from the herbal, something older, something her mother had shown her without explanation, something that the priest would probably have had opinions about if he had known, not because she doubted God, but because the world was large and somewhat unruly and you used what you had. The church calendar was the architecture of her year in a way that is genuinely difficult to convey to someone for whom the calendar is primarily secular, a grid of months and weeks without inherent meaning attached to the days themselves. For her, the calendar was saturated with meaning. Every week had its fast days, every month had its feast days. The great festivals of the liturgical year, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, Martinmas, Candlemas, were the landmarks by which time was measured and the year was given its shape. This was not primarily theological, it was practical and social. The feast days were the days of rest, not a concept with a specific economic definition, but actual rest, the cessation of field labour, the gathering of the community at the church and then in whatever social celebration the village permitted itself. The feast day was when the ale flowed a little more freely, when the games happened in the churchyard, and they did happen, despite the clergy's repeated and largely unsuccessful attempts to prevent it, when the community was community in the fullest sense, gathered and temporarily released from the urgency of work. Michaelmas in late September, the feast of the Archangel Michael, marked the end of the agricultural year and the beginning of the new one. It was when rents were due, when accounts were settled, when the harvest results were finally tallied against the year's obligations. It was when the surplus of autumn was most visible, the storage at its fullest before the long drawdown of winter began. The feast was earned. The community knew what it had come through. Christmas, not the single day of the modern secular calendar, but the 12 days of the Christmas season from December 25th through January 6th, was the midwinter festival, and whatever its Christian theological content, it served the function that midwinter festivals have always served in northern climates, to provide warmth and light and communal pleasure in the darkest weeks of the year, to create a reason to gather and eat better than usual, and to feel, collectively, that the darkness was survivable. She valued this. The specific religious content aside, the structure of a year that built in periods of communal celebration, of rest, of gathering around shared meaning, was a structure that served the human need for rhythm and for relief. A life of pure unbroken labour with no official pause would have been different in quality, more relentless, more isolated, from the life that the church calendar, for all its doctrinal complexity and institutional failings, actually provided. The local church was also the community's primary civic space. The church building was the largest structure in the village, and often the only stone structure, which meant it was also the most durable, the most permanent, the reference point around which everything else was oriented. Parish records were kept there, records of births and deaths and marriages, the community's vital statistics maintained by the priest. The churchyard was the burial ground, which meant it was also the community's ongoing relationship with its own dead. The dead were not remote in medieval England. They were present in the churchyard that you passed on the way to the fields. They were present in the masses said for their souls, the anniversary requiems, the All Souls' Day observations in November, the whole elaborate apparatus of intercessory prayer that connected the living community to the dead through the ongoing work of prayer. The family members who had died were spoken of in religious contexts, prayed for, maintained in the community's religious memory, in a way that gave death a different relationship to daily life than the modern tendency to separate and compartmentalize grief allows. She had people in that churchyard. Everyone did, in a community where childhood mortality was high, and where adult death from illness, accident, and complication of childbirth came earlier and more commonly than in our world. The prayers she said were also prayers for them, the child who had not survived infancy, the mother or father or sibling in the ground beneath the yew tree at the east end of the churchyard. This is not morbid. I want to be careful not to make it morbid. It is simply a different relationship to the presence of the dead in daily life, less separating, less sealed off, more ongoing. The dead were included in the community's religious practice in a way that kept them, in some sense, within reach. The prayers at the end of the day extended that reach, for the living and the dead, for tomorrow and for what had already passed, for the fire to last through the night, and for the children to wake healthy, and for whatever was asked in the particular language of need that each household carried that was entirely its own. The priest did not know these prayers. They were not said in church. They were said here in the firelight by a woman at the end of a long day, in the plain language of someone speaking to someone who she believed was listening. Whether or not anyone was listening, that question is not mine to answer. But the prayers were real, the need was real, and the act of speaking them, of organising the day's gratitude and the day's fear into words directed somewhere beyond the walls, was real in the way that the fire was real, in the way that the pottage was real, in the way that the sleeping children were real. It was what you did when the candle was out and the darkness was in and the night was very long. You spoke into it. And then you slept. The children are asleep now. Let me tell you what it took to get them there, and what that process looked like, and what it meant that childhood in this period was so genuinely different from the childhood we know now. And yet, in the specific moments before sleep, so recognisably the same. The concept of childhood as a distinct and protected phase of life, a period of extended dependence and play, and formal education, separated clearly from the adult world of labour and responsibility, is, historically speaking, quite new. The historian Philippe Ariès made this argument famously and controversially in the 1960s, and scholars have been refining and debating it ever since. The pure version of his argument, that medieval people did not love their children or experience them as children at all, but simply as small adults, is now considered an overcorrection, unsupported by the evidence. What the evidence does support is something more nuanced. Medieval children were not experienced as a special category of human being, requiring isolation from the adult world in the way that modern developmental theory and modern education have established as the baseline. They were present in the adult world from very young, They observed and participated in adult work from the moment they were physically capable of any contribution. They were not shielded from death or illness or the material realities of the household in the way that modern childhood typically tries to do. But they were loved. The evidence for this is abundant and direct. The wills of medieval parents, even quite poor ones, show specific and individual bequests to name children. This particular child gets this particular thing, not because it is the most valuable thing in the estate, but because it is the right thing for this child specifically. The correspondence of medieval parents, where it survives, contains the same specific anxiety and specific tenderness that any parent in any era would recognize. The archaeological record includes children's toys, tiny clay figurines, small-wheeled carts, miniature versions of adult tools, in the ruins of medieval homes, including peasant homes, evidence that someone made or obtained these things for a child's pleasure. Children played. Of course they played. The children of the medieval village played in the lane outside the cottages and in the field's margins and along the riverbank. They played with the animals. They invented games with the materials around them, sticks and stones and the small world of the village, familiar with the total and creative familiarity that children bring to any environment they inhabit fully. And they were afraid of things. Every child in every era is afraid of things in the dark. This has not changed and will not change because the fear is older than any cultural configuration of childhood. The dark is large and the child is small, and the large dark outside the small warm circle of firelight is exactly the thing that the primal, unrefined animal part of a child's brain has been recognizing as a threat for as long as there have been children. In a medieval peasant cottage, the dark outside the fire's reach was very dark indeed. She knew this about her children. She managed it in the way that parents in every era manage it, with the tools available to her, the fire kept at the right level, the sleeping arrangement that put the youngest nearest the warmth, and nearest the sleeping adult bodies whose presence was itself a form of reassurance, and the stories. The bedtime story is very old. Not as a genre, not as the illustrated picture book or the chapter book or the audio recording that the modern child knows, but as a practice, as the use of narrative at the end of the day to settle a child's mind, to give the imagination something specific and enclosed to inhabit rather than the open, unstructured space where fear grows. This is very old. It is older than medieval England. It is probably as old as fire and children and darkness together. What stories did she tell them? She would have told them the stories she'd been told as a child, in the same cottage or one very much like it, by the same fire or its equivalent. Stories from the oral tradition of her community, not fixed texts but living stories, each telling slightly different from the last, responsive to the teller and the audience and the mood of the evening. Some of these stories were religious in content. The lives of the saints simplified and dramatized for a young audience. St. George and the Dragon, which was not primarily a story about heroism in the way the modern version tends to emphasize, but about the specific combat between Christian faith and the monstrous, with the dragon standing in for everything that threatened the community from outside. St. Nicholas and his gifts, the story of the Nativity, told close to Christmas, familiar in its outlines but always slightly new in the specific telling. And some of the stories were older than the church. The fairy stories of medieval England were not the prettified, defanged fairy tales of later collection and adaptation. They were genuinely ambivalent narratives about beings that were powerful and largely indifferent to human welfare, beings that needed managing rather than defeating, that required specific protocols of behaviour if you wanted to avoid their attention, that could be propitious or disastrous depending on whether you had done the right things in the right way. Do not leave the house at night without a charm. Do not accept food from a stranger met at a crossroads. Do not enter the old barrow on the hill, not at midsummer, not ever. Do not speak ill of the fair folk by name. These were the stories that served as children's practical education in the world they actually inhabited, a world in which the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were understood to be porous, in which the behaviour of certain places and certain times of year was genuinely governed by forces that the formal theology of the church and the informal folklore of the village both had opinions about, and where a child who knew the rules was a child who would not do something foolish at the wrong time and place. She told these stories with the same matter-of-fact directness that she brought to teaching her children which plants were edible. This is how the world is. This is what you need to know to be safe in it. The youngest child was usually asleep before the story was finished. There is a specific pleasure in watching a child fall asleep to a story, the moment when the eyes finally close for good, when the body releases its last held tension, when the breathing deepens and you know they are gone. She would have known that moment. Every parent knows it in every era with the specific relief and tenderness of having gotten them there. The day has been managed. They are safe. They are asleep. The older children were more demanding. The 8-year-old, the 10-year-old, old enough to know that being sent to sleep is a kind of exclusion from the adult world that continues beyond their consciousness. Old enough to negotiate, to ask one more question, to require one more story. Old enough to notice the shadows at the edge of the fire's reach and to find them interesting rather than purely frightening. She was patient with this. Not infinitely patient. She was tired, and the morning was going to come earlier than the child had any concept of, and the patience of an exhausted woman at the end of a long day has real limits that deserve honest acknowledgement. But patient enough. She answered the question. She told the second story, shorter than the first. She sat with her hand on the child's back until the breathing changed. Then she went back to her work. Because the children being asleep was not the end of the evening's labour. It was simply the quieter portion of it. The mending still needed doing. The wool still needed spinning. The household's ongoing production of thread and cloth and repaired garments waited for no one's convenience. But there is a quality to working while the children sleep that is different from working while they are awake. A quieter quality, a more interior quality, that many parents in many eras have recognised and even quietly prized. The work continues, but the context changes. The responsibility is not currently requiring your full active attention. The small part of the mind that is always partly given over to monitoring the children can rest, just for a little while, and the rest of the attention can go to the work at hand. The spindle turned, the fire breathed, the children slept. I want to say one more thing about medieval childhood before we move on, because I think it is the thing that most complicates the simple narrative of deprivation that the period is sometimes reduced to. Medieval children who survived infancy, and the mortality rate in infancy and early childhood was genuinely devastating. Something between 1/4 and 1/3 of children dying before the age of 5 in most studied populations. Medieval children who survived were robust in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from inside our current understanding of childhood fragility. They were physically capable from very young because the household required it. They were socially fluent because they had been embedded in the full social life of the village from birth. They knew the natural world, the plants, the animals, the weather, the seasonal rhythms, with an intimacy that most modern adults do not possess, and that took them no special effort to acquire, because it was simply the texture of their daily existence. And they were embedded in a community. Not isolated into nuclear families behind closed doors and garden fences, embedded in a village where the adults were known and the other children were known, and the landscape was known and the stories were known. Where a child who wandered too far from home in either literal or behavioural terms would be encountered by someone who knew their family and would bring them back, or send word, or deal with the situation in the particular informal way that close-knit communities deal with situations. This is not idealised. The village also knew your business in ways that were sometimes oppressive, and the informal social enforcement that kept the community together could turn brutal in the direction of anyone who fell outside the community's definition of acceptable. The same structures that provided support also provided surveillance, and the two were inseparable. But for a child, for the specific experience of a childhood embedded in a known world, there was something in it that the more mobile, more private, more individually bounded modern childhood does not fully replicate. A sense of being held by something larger than the family alone, of knowing where you were in relation to everything else, the church at the centre, the fields at the edges, the cottages between, the whole familiar geography of a world small enough to understand. She looked at them sleeping. The youngest had curled onto their side, one hand open near their face, the way small children sleep, the whole body soft and released, the face smooth. The older one had not fully settled, one knee drawn up, the sleeping body still carrying something of the day's alertness, the particular vigilance of a child who is not quite sure it is safe to fully let go yet. She adjusted the blanket. She moved the hair from the older child's face. These are gestures from outside of time. They belong to no particular century. They are simply what a parent does when a child is asleep. The small adjustments of care that serve no purpose except care itself, that cannot be seen by the child, that no one will record, that exist only in the moment of their occurrence and then are gone. She went back to the spindle. The fire breathed. The night continued. Once a week, sometimes more in the pressing seasons, she and her husband paid with their bodies for the right to live where they lived. This is the reality of medieval villenage, the legal status that bound a significant proportion of the English peasantry to their lord's land, and I want to state it plainly before I say anything else, because the history of medieval rural life is sometimes presented with a nostalgic softness that its actual conditions do not fully warrant. The peasant household we have been sitting with all evening was not free in the sense that the word now carries. The family's relationship to the land was defined by a set of obligations, dues, labour services, fees, that were not negotiable and not escapable without significant risk. The unfree peasant, the villain, owed his lord labour, not metaphorical labour, not taxes paid in grain at harvest time, though those were also owed, actual physical work, days per week spent ploughing the lord's domain, the home farm that the lord kept in his own direct management, with the lord's plough teams and under the supervision of the lord's reeve. In the busy seasons of ploughing and harvest, these labour demands intensified. The lord's crops were worked before the peasant's own, because the lord's crops came first, because the lord said so and the law agreed with the lord. In a bad year, in a year when the weather was difficult and the window for ploughing or harvesting was narrow, this could mean the difference between a peasant family's fields being properly worked and not. The labour owed to the lord was extracted from the same body in the same hours that the family's own survival required. Her husband, spent those days at the lord's work. She managed what needed managing in his absence, which was everything. There were also fees. The fee paid when a villain's son or daughter married, merche, the lord's acknowledgement that his serf's family was changing and he wished to be compensated for it, or perhaps that he wished to retain the right to approve the match, which amounted to the same thing in practice. The heriot, the fee paid to the lord at a villain's death, which in many cases took the form of the family's best animal. At the moment of greatest loss, the family also lost something material. The mill suit, the requirement that grain be ground at the lord's mill, where the miller took his percentage for the grinding, rather than hand grinding at home, which would have been cheaper. These were not exceptional demands. They were the ordinary cost of living in a tied tenancy in medieval England. The lord himself was often not physically present. The great lords of England, the barons, the earls, the major ecclesiastical landowners like the bishop or the monastery, held multiple manors scattered across the country and moved between them in a seasonal circuit. The day-to-day management of any given manor was delegated to a hierarchy of local officials: the steward, who oversaw the lord's affairs across all his holdings, the bailiff, who managed the specific manor, and the reeve, who was elected from among the villain tenants themselves and served as the interface between the lord's demands and the community's capacity to meet them. The reeve was an interesting figure. He was one of them, a villain, a member of the community he administered, and yet he served the lord's interests. This created a position of genuine and sometimes painful ambiguity. A reeve who enforced the lord's demands too harshly alienated his neighbours and made his own daily life in the village difficult. A reeve who protected his neighbours at the lord's expense risked the lord's displeasure and the consequences that carried. The best reeves navigated this, the way that anyone in a middle management position in any organisational structure navigates it, with information management, with selective emphasis, with the careful calibration of what to report and what to quietly resolve before it became a matter of record. She knew the reeve, of course she did. Everyone knew the reeve. He lived in the village, his children played with her children in the lane. She was aware of the difficulty of his position in the specific way that people who live very close together are aware of each other's difficulties. The manor court, which met 4 or 5 times a year, was the legal space in which the relationship between the lord's demands and the community's reality was periodically renegotiated. Not dramatically, not adversarially in most cases, but in the ongoing low-level process of fine and judgment and record that constituted medieval village legal life. A fine for failure to perform a labour obligation, a ruling on a boundary dispute between neighbouring strips, a judgment about whether a particular customary right to gather wood from the common, to graze a certain number of animals on the pasture, had been exceeded. These records survive. They survive in the estate records of major landowners, in the archive of manors that were lucky enough to have their documents preserved through the dissolution of the monasteries and the great upheavals of later centuries, and they are one of our most direct windows into the daily reality of medieval peasant life. The names in those records, the people paying fines, the people bringing complaints, the people being called to account for specific actions on specific dates, are real people. They were alive. They had the kind of day we have been describing this evening. In the Manor Court record, she is almost invisible. Women appear in the records less frequently than men because the legal framework of the Manor Court addressed primarily the obligations of the unfree tenant, and the tenant was legally the male head of the household. His name was attached to the holding. His labour was the labour owed. His death triggered the Heriot. But she was there, in the background of every record, doing the work that made the holding function, managing the household's resources with the skill and knowledge that kept the family above the margin, raising the children who would eventually inherit the tenancy and pay the fees and perform the labour in the next generation. The Lord did not count her. The record does not show her. But without her, there was no record to make, because without her management there was no household functioning well enough to meet its obligations. I want to be careful not to make this into a simple story of invisible heroism, because I think that framing can itself be a kind of condescension. The idea that her value lay entirely in her suffering invisibility, that what matters about her is what she endured rather than what she was. She was not a martyr. She was a person who managed a complex household under specific constraints, and did it, most days, adequately or better. The constraints were real, the obligations were real, the dependency on the Lord's goodwill, or at least his indifference to her specific household, was real. A lord who decided to raise the customary dues, or who enforced a right that had historically been left alone, or who simply had a difficult steward who looked for additional sources of revenue, could make a family situation significantly worse, with very limited recourse available to the family in question. And yet the villanage system was not simply a machine for extraction without any corresponding provision. The lord who destroyed his peasantry destroyed his own labour force and his own income, which created a practical incentive, not a moral one, but a practical one, to maintain conditions that kept the tenantry functioning. The customary rights that the village community held, to the common pasture, to the wood, to the gleaning of the harvested fields, were real rights, defended in the manor court, genuinely understood by both parties as part of the implicit contract of the tenancy. When the lord violated those rights, when he enclosed common land that the village had used for generations, or when he demanded labour above the customary amount, the community sometimes pushed back. The manor court records contain examples of collective resistance that range from the politely legalistic to the considerably more direct. The 14th century in particular, with the disruption of the Black Death, and the labour shortage it produced, and the political upheaval of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, saw the terms of this relationship renegotiated by people who decided they were done with the existing arrangement. This is not a story she knew the end of because the end had not happened yet. But she knew the beginning of it. She knew what the obligations cost. She knew what the household gave up every week to satisfy the Lord's claim. She knew the calculation. The days of labour that were the Lord's, set against the days of labour that were the family's, the balance between what was owed and what was left over for survival. And she managed within it. Not joyfully, not with the resigned contentment that some romanticised accounts of medieval life assign to the peasantry. With the pragmatic intelligence of someone who understands the system they are operating within, and who optimises for the family's welfare as best the system allows. Who knows which obligations are fixed and which have some flexibility? Who knows when to comply completely and when the customary right is worth defending? Who keeps track of what is owed and what has been paid with the same precision she brings to the household's food stores? She was good at this. She had to be. The alternative was worse. Outside tonight, the village belongs to the darkness. The Lord's manor house, if there is one within sight, and in many manors there is, the stone-built hall on the slight rise above the village that is the largest building for miles in any direction, is also dark or lit with more candles than she has ever burned in a week, depending on whether the Lord is in residence and whether there are guests. She does not often think about what is happening there. The Lord's world is a different order of thing from the world she inhabits, as different in its way as the world of the clergy in the church tower and the world of the travelling merchant on the road. She is aware of it. She has a clear-eyed understanding of what it takes from her and what it leaves. But it is not part of the texture of her daily life the way the fire is, the way the children are, the way the village is. What is part of the texture of her life is the specific way that the obligations shape the week. Tuesday and Wednesday, or whatever the customary labour days are for this particular manor, which varied by tenancy and by period and by local tradition, are the days that her husband is at the Lord's work rather than the family's. She runs the holding differently on those days. She makes different decisions about what can wait and what cannot. She covers what would ordinarily be his tasks with what she can manage alone. She has done this so many times that it is not a disruption. It is simply the shape of the week. The fire is very low now. The night is deep. The children have been asleep for hours and the adults are close behind them, the day's exhaustion having had its way finally with even the most persistent wakefulness. She sets down the spindle. She has done enough. The work that remains will be there tomorrow. The work is always there tomorrow. That is the nature of work that is not performed toward completion, but toward continuity. The work of maintaining a household, rather than building something with a defined end. She lies down. The darkness is complete. The fire is almost entirely at its coals now, a deep red, barely visible, a warmth rather than a light. The thatch rustles in whatever wind has come up in the night. The owl that called at dusk has been quiet for some time. This is the last hour before midnight, the deepest hour. The hour that medieval people called the watches of the night, which had its own relationship to prayer, the night offices, the monastic hours that the clergy observed at midnight and at dawn, the practice of waking in the night to pray that some particularly devout lay people also practiced. She does not do this. She's not a mystic. She's a woman who has been awake since before dawn, and has had a full day of continuous labour and whose body is done. She sleeps. The fire breathes. The village breathes. The night passes over the thatched roofs and the sleeping fields and the churchyard with its quiet population, and the manor house on the hill and the road that leads away from here toward the market town, which is 2 days' walk and which she has been to perhaps 3 times in her life. Beyond the road, the country. Beyond the country, the world. And in the middle of all of it, this cottage, this fire, these sleeping people. Small, specific, sufficient. Not every evening was easy. I have been giving you the ordinary evening, the adequate evening, the evening when the pottage was made and the children were settled and the fire lasted, and no one was seriously ill, and the obligations had been met, and that evening was real. It was the most common evening. It was Tuesday in its most Tuesday form. But there were other evenings. There was the evening when the child's breathing had a quality to it that made everything else in the room less important than watching it, when the fever that had seemed manageable in the afternoon had crossed into something that required staying awake, when the cough that all children got in the damp of November had moved deeper into the chest and was producing a sound that the mother of this child recognised from other times and other children and knew for what it was. Childhood illness in medieval England was the central domestic fear. Not theoretically, not as a background worry, as a specific and regular presence in the household's experience. In a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without any effective treatment for the serious infectious diseases that moved through communities periodically, the plague that would devastate England in the 1340s most catastrophically, but also measles, smallpox, the sweating sickness, the various fevers that the period's medicine did not distinguish clearly between, a sick child was a genuine emergency with genuinely uncertain outcomes. She knew things that helped. She had learned them from her mother and from the women of the village, and from the accumulated practical knowledge of a community that had been managing illness with no other resources for generations. The herbs in the rafters were not merely for cooking. The chamomile was made into a warm infusion for fever. The elderberry, prepared and preserved from the autumn's harvest, had properties that modern research has since confirmed. Antiviral compounds that may genuinely reduce the severity of respiratory illness. The thyme, steeped in hot water and inhaled over a cloth, was given to a child with a deep chest cough because something in the experience of doing it seemed to ease the coughing, and it does, because thymol is a genuine expectorant. She did not know the chemistry of this, she knew the practice. This is the distinction that matters in understanding what medieval medicine actually was in the hands of the people who practiced it at the household level. It was not magic, though the line between practical herbalism and symbolic protection was not always clearly drawn. It was not the learned medicine of the university-trained physician, which in any case was available only to those with the means to pay for it. It was empirical knowledge, tested over generations, adapted and refined and passed down through the female line of the household, in the same way that recipes and prayers and methods for banking a fire were passed down. Some of it worked, some of it did not. Some of it had no direct physical effect but had genuine comfort value, which is itself a form of effect in a context where a sick child needed the reassurance of being actively cared for as much as it needed any specific treatment. She sat up with the sick child. This is the specific form of the hardest evenings, not the dramatic crisis of a sudden catastrophe, but the long, slow, watchful night of a parent sitting with a feverish child while the rest of the household slept, making sure the fever did not climb further, keeping the child comfortable, responding to each waking with the specific reassurance the child needed, a voice they knew, a hand on the forehead, the confirmation that they were not alone in the dark. This has not changed. I mean that quite literally. Everything else about the circumstance, the cottage, the rushes on the floor, the tallow candle burned down to its base, the particular quality of the fear, all of that belongs to the 14th century. But the experience of sitting up with a sick child, the vigil of it, the love that is expressed entirely through presence rather than through anything more active because there is nothing more active available, that is not historical, that is permanent. She sat by the fire and watched the breathing. In the worst cases, and the worst cases happened, they happened in every village, in every generation. The breathing stopped, or the fever crested past what the child's body could manage, or what had seemed like a manageable illness became something else overnight. And then the morning was a different kind of morning entirely, and the days that followed were the days of grief that every culture in every period has had to find its way through. I do not want to dwell on this, not because it was rare, it was not rare, but because the purpose of dwelling in this household tonight is not to catalogue its losses. Those losses were real, and they were part of the texture of life in this period, in a way that cannot be left out honestly, but they are not the whole story, and I do not want to tip the balance of the evening toward them. What I want to say instead is this: the community helped. When a child was seriously ill, the women of the village came. Not because they were asked, not because there was a formal structure for this kind of assistance, but because in a community where everyone's material circumstances were visible and everyone's difficulties were known, the response to a neighbour's crisis was automatic. It was also self-interested in the best sense. The family that helped now was the family that could call on help later, and everyone knew this, and the knowledge made the giving easier rather than diminishing it. A neighbour came to sit with the child so the mother could sleep. A neighbour brought food, pottage from her own pot, a portion of her household's provisions, the specific practical gift of a meal that did not need to be made by the household that was already stretched to its limit. The women gathered and they applied their collective knowledge to the case. This child, these symptoms, what had worked in similar cases before, what the elder woman in the village had recommended when her grandchildren had presented the same way. The elder woman in the village. Every medieval community of any size had one, the woman whose age and experience had made her the repository of the community's medical and domestic knowledge, the one you called on when the herbalism you knew was not enough, when the situation exceeded your own experience, when you needed someone who had seen more. Her knowledge was not licensed or credentialed or documented anywhere. It existed entirely in her head and her hands, and it was the primary medical resource available to the peasant household. She was not a witch. I want to say this clearly because the popular image of the medieval wise woman has been substantially shaped by the witch trial records of a later period, the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, when the Church's anxiety about unlicensed medical and spiritual practice intersected catastrophically with political upheaval and communal scapegoating to produce the persecution of women who practiced exactly the kind of traditional knowledge that the elder woman in the village possessed. In the 14th century, the period we are in tonight, this figure was primarily a community resource rather than a community threat. She was the person you sent for when the illness was serious. She was the person who attended births, the midwife, the word itself simply meaning with woman, the one who was present for the most dangerous transition in a medieval woman's life, the one whose knowledge of what to do when a birth went wrong was the difference between life and death. Childbirth was the most dangerous ordinary event in a medieval woman's life. The maternal mortality rate in medieval England, and this is a figure that historians have debated and refined across many decades of demographic research, drawing on parish records and ecclesiastical records and the skeletal remains of women from excavated medieval cemeteries, was genuinely significant. Estimates vary, but the consensus is that something between 1 and 2% of all births resulted in the mother's death. In a world where women might give birth 8 or 10 or 12 times across their fertile years, this accumulated into a genuine lifetime risk. She knew this. Every married woman in the village knew this because they had all seen it happen. The neighbour who had not survived her last pregnancy, the young wife who had died of fever following a birth that seemed to have gone well, the grandmother whose stories of losing friends in childbed were not history but living memory. She carried this knowledge into every pregnancy. Not as panic. Panic is not useful, and in any case the medieval temperament toward death, shaped by the religious framework of a world that understood earthly life as a prelude to something else, was not our temperament, but as awareness. The awareness that the event that would bring another person into the household was also an event that carried real risk for the person doing the carrying. The midwife was her primary protection against that risk, not a guaranteed protection, no such thing existed, but the most experienced, most knowledgeable, most practically effective protection available to her. I want to say one more thing about the sick and the vulnerable in the medieval village before we move toward the end of this evening's journey. There were people in every community whose circumstances placed them permanently at the margins. The very old, the disabled, the families who had suffered a catastrophic loss of the working adult who made the holding function. Widows with children too young to contribute labour. Men incapacitated by injury or illness. Families whose land was not enough, even in good years, to fully sustain them. The church had formal mechanisms for addressing this. The parish poor relief, the obligation of alms-giving that Christian teaching placed on all members of the community, the monastery's distribution of food and assistance at its gates. But these formal mechanisms were supplementary to the informal ones. The neighbourhood network of small, mutual, ongoing assistance that was the real infrastructure of survival for the most vulnerable members of the community. She participated in this. Not grandly, not as charity in the modern sense of a transaction between someone who has and someone who has not, with the asymmetry that implies, but as neighbour. The portion of pottage sent to the house, at the end of the lane where the widow was managing alone, the afternoon's work given to help with a harvest that could not be completed by one pair of hands, the knowledge shared, the ember offered, the children looked after for an afternoon. These were small transactions. They were not recorded anywhere. They were simply the ongoing maintenance of a community's capacity to hold its most vulnerable members, conducted daily, invisibly, by the women who were the community's primary connective tissue. This was not heroism. It was not even fully conscious most of the time as a moral choice. It was just what you did, in a world where everyone understood that need was not a permanent personal failing but a temporary condition that could happen to anyone, and that today's help given was the reasonable basis for tomorrow's help received. The fire was very low now. She had done what she could for the sick child. The breathing was easier in the last hour, the fever seeming to have eased slightly with the chamomile infusion, and the cool cloth on the small forehead. She would check again before dawn. She always did. But for now, for this hour, the child was sleeping and she allowed herself to close her eyes. The village was at its quietest. The deepest part of the night, the hour when even the light sleepers had long since gone under, when the fires in every cottage were at their minimum, when the darkness was most complete, and the cold had fully arrived and the stars above the cloud or through it were doing their slow ancient work overhead. This was the night. This specific night, in this specific village, in this specific cottage, with this fire and these children and this woman who has been awake since before dawn, and who will be awake again before dawn, and who, in the hours between, is something that history almost never names clearly. She is the one who tends things. The fire, the children, the household stores, the sick, the relationships with neighbours that keep the community together, the prayers said for the living and the dead, the knowledge passed down, the herbs dried, the wool spun, the bread baked, the work done and done and done again, every day, in all weathers, in all seasons, quietly, without record. She tends things. And the thing she tends, the fire, the household, the children, the community, these are not small things dressed up as large ones for the purposes of a sympathetic retelling. They are actually the substance of what sustains human life. The basic requirements, warmth, food, care, community, that every human being has needed in every period of history, that have always required someone to provide, that are still required today in every household and every community on the planet. She provided them in this cottage, on this evening in the 14th century in England. She will provide them again tomorrow. The fire breathed its slow red breath. The night held everything it held. Come back to the beginning. The cottage is the same. The thatch is the same, the earth floor, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters with the onions and the dried mushrooms, the single window with its shutter still closed against the dark. The fire is at its lowest now. The coals that have held through the night, breathing so slowly they are nearly indistinguishable from the grey ash around them, but alive, still alive. The household is asleep. The village outside is in the last deepest silence before the first bird of the morning begins its business in the hedgerow. That silence is not empty, it is full of the held breath of everything that has been sustained through the night. The fire, the family, the ember in every hearth that has kept going. She is almost asleep. Not quite. In the place between sleeping and waking, still aware of the sound of the children's breathing, still faintly monitoring the fire's state, still present in the way that the person who tends things is always slightly present even in the deepest rest. The night has been long, the day before it was long, the day that is coming will be long in the same way. This is the shape of a life, not the shape of a story with a beginning and a problem and a resolution. The shape of a life which is mostly continuation. The work done today so that the work can be done tomorrow, the fire lit this morning so that it can be lit again tomorrow morning, the children kept safe through this night so that they can be kept safe through the next one. I've been sitting with this household for many hours now, in my own way. I've been thinking about what it means to tend things in the dark, without record, without recognition, without the possibility of stepping back and seeing clearly whether what you're doing matters. She did not know that anyone would ever think about her evening. She could not have imagined it. The distance is too great and the mechanisms of it too strange. A voice, many centuries later, describing her cottage to people lying in their own beds, in their own dark, in a world she had no vocabulary to picture. It would not have made sense to her. The world we inhabit would not have made sense. But here is what I keep coming back to. The fire that she lit this morning, not this specific fire, not this specific morning, but the human practice of which this morning's fire is one instance. That practice is continuous. It did not stop when she died. It was continued by her children and her grandchildren, and the long chain of people who came after her, tending their own versions of the same fire in different rooms in different centuries, with different tools and different fuels, but toward the same end. Warmth, food, the keeping of the household through the night. We still do this, in different forms, with different means, but we still do this. The kettle put on in the morning before anyone else is up. The children checked before bed. The small domestic rituals that are not heroic and not glamorous, and that constitute in aggregate the actual substance of what a life is made of. She knew this, in her bones, without having words for it. That the daily work was not preparation for something else. That the fire